Hello, people. Hello, everybody. Okay. This week I read My Early Life by Winston Churchill. This one was, let's see, this one was an audiobook. I have that Audible Plus, so it gives you access to certain of the books. This was one of those that I have access to, right? Which I'm like, I wonder if I should keep saying that. Part of me is like, no, because maybe in the future you won't be able to have access to it like that because things come and go off that list. But then the other half of me, I think, feels like it's a good way to judge, right? Because you're watching, you might have some sort of judgment on this book. And the fact that I haven't bought it maybe is some extra added judgment that you can take. So I'm just going to keep saying sort of where I get these books. In any case, I have the Audible Plus, and it's a not a free book. You're paying, but you're able to access it through the subscription. And it's Winston Churchill's, and I like everything Winston Churchill, so I'm like, I'll give it a go. Um, the reader is Frederick Davidson. He does the whole book in sort of like a Winston Churchill impersonation, which I guess for some people would be very annoying, but it really works for me. I almost If the narration doesn't sound like Winston Churchill, I almost won't get the book. This is how much I like it to sound like Winston Churchill. I really like it. The rating. The rating on this one is got to be a 3 out of 5. It's very much in its own little pocket. I don't think there's enough here that draws you from outside your genre to come listen to this. It is good. It is great writing. Winston Churchill is super good at that. But I don't think even sort of the action we follow along, it's not narratively driven like that. So if you're really into history, if you're on like a British kick, right? So if you just read Pride and Prejudice and you loved it, or you watched every episode of Downton Abbey and you loved it, these type of things, if you're in a British history mode, you'll absolutely love it. But for everyone else, I think you could avoid it until you get that urge. I think you'll be better off that way. But if you're just a big time reader, right? So verbiage alone can bring you to the show and you'll enjoy the party. You definitely come into this party. His verbiage is top notch. Also for me, you're not gonna get this often in books, just the nature of the beast, but it's the importance of it is the author himself almost, right? So almost anything that he would write about, he'll take as a historical interest because he's such a historical figure. Add to it that he's funny and that it's good writing, and that just helps. So some of the things in it aren't in and of themselves important. He can make them important, but then even if he didn't so much, you could get an importance out of it for a historical sake. So it's one of these weird situations that I'm trying to think happens anywhere else, and I don't see it much. Where a lot of what is it? There's a lot of inroads intersecting right on Churchill, so that it elevates whatever it is you're reading from him. All right, now I'm gonna get into the book a little bit. A little bit. We don't. It's a history of his life, but he's not using. He's not. He doesn't really go with dates like next to it all. I think he said a year twice. He said his age a few times. So even when he's 5 or 6, he's describing it the same as he would describe when he's fully grown and like in a war, if that makes sense. It's very fun. He he's quick, he's witty, funny, very funny. But I wouldn't, let's see, how do I say this? It didn't feel like I was reading a book. It felt like if I got sort of dressed up and went to a fancy Buckingham Palace or something, and Churchill's the guest, and he just starts talking and sort of entertaining the dinner party, and we're all just sitting there listening to him. That's honestly what it felt like. Or where they have the whatever the whiskey rooms or whatever, where you just sit, all the men just sit and smoke cigars. It feels like I could just smoke a cigar and listen to this man talk, and it just whatever he says is interesting. That's what it feels like. A conversation. I'm in the room with Winston Churchill, and he's just talking to me. That's what it reads like. It really doesn't have a typical narration as a story might. Even compared to other histories, it's not. A lot of them have more because it's his story. It's a story, and they let that story drive. And he doesn't. He's constantly pushing what's happening. It's very, very fun. It's very interesting. In a lot of ways, it's how I wish I could talk, right? He sounds like how I wish I could talk. Okay, so he starts, and you got to remember, he was born in the Victorian age, and he grew through that to the New Age. He's one of these figures that's the transitional figure, right? And a lot of times I've heard it in spots in this book and in spots in other books, where he sort of laments the losses that we had from the aristocratic statesman to democracy. And for me, this sounded weird. Obviously, I've grown up in democracy. Most of the people watching have grown up in democracy. But when you look back through history, every sort of new idea in government, right? Napoleon has a new idea. They then think that's better for the whole world. And then we push that on everyone. And wars happen, and things go up and down. And some are more successful than others. Now, in my mind, that was always a dictator or somebody horrible, right? It never occurred to me that maybe some people like that form of government. That maybe in some ways that form of government's better. And that democracy itself is that dictator in a lot of ways. That we being democracy, push our ideas out and in and on to people. And that maybe this isn't the right way, even for us, even for America, right? And like, what do I mean? And I didn't get it until, again, Winston Churchill told me, in a manner of speaking. But in his era, you were born into sort of your slot in government. If your dad was prime minister, you could probably be prime minister. If your dad was privy council, you could, these higher ups were already higher up. And from the outside, that would almost look like, well, yeah, it's easy for you. You're all in charge. But then you look back at the history of England and you wonder, why did it work so well for so long? Right? What happened? Well, what you had is a ruling class, a group of people, they all know each other. And we end up with, and Churchill says this, not in this book, in other books, but he said it, a sense of it in this book, where you end up with your social circle being the judge of you. Right? Not the people, no, almost not even yourself, which in a lot of ways is a higher law than just laws, right? So if it's socially unacceptable to stand on a table at a restaurant, that will be more powerful than a law saying you cannot stand on a table in a restaurant, right? You see more You see less breaking of social norms than you see of laws in a lot of instances. So if the social norm is to be in government and to do a good job, and a good job being some benefit to the empire, some benefit to the people, right? Then your failures are social failures as much as national ones, right? Now, so I think you would get more drive out of more people, right? So these statesmen in his day, in the Victorian era, may have tried harder than democratically elected officials are trying. And a lot of times you see elected officials, you go in, you get your money, and you start to care less because there's less of a pressure on them, right? And I'm like, I think this makes a little bit of sense. If you look back, I think it makes sense in a weird kind of a way. And in a weird way, we seem to do it ourselves, right? We don't, if we had a choice between one doctor, two doctors are really good. But one, his father and his grandfather and his great grandfather were doctors, and the other is a first time family member doctor. We might choose the family doctor more, right? We do it in sports where he's the son of so and so, he's the nephew of Peyton Manning, right? And in politics, a lot of times too. McCaskill is the daughter of the other former senator, right? We keep a lineage without even being forced. It's a weird sort of dynamic. But that's what it got me thinking. Because I'm like, yes, these statesmen, British history is full of errors, right? But so is democracy. Democracy has all sorts of errors. I don't know if there's a higher success rate in democracy. There's more in freedoms, in capitalism, but I don't know about democracy from a governmental perspective. I don't know if it's more successful. We'll have to wait, right? America's only 200 years old. The British Empire was 600 years old? It was a long time they were running that crap. Okay, that's sort of how it starts in my mind. Again, I got a little off subject. Okay. So we start, he's a young person. And he has a tendency, he does this. His temperament's the same throughout the book. And in some instances, he rises higher than sort of the subject matter deserves, right? So he's young, and the governess, there's some governess, needs him to read without crying. So you know how young he is, right? That's what they're like. You're going to have to read without crying. And she's going to be back in a certain amount of time. Well, the time's coming, and he realizes he's not going to be able to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. So he goes, and I did what all oppressed peoples have done throughout the ages. I took to the woods. Right? He has this funny, witty British way of over amplifying maybe a small thing, but then under dampening sort of a major thing, right? So we're talking about learning to read as a 5-year-old, and he's using oppressed people and flee to the woods, right? But then he's like in a firefight in a war, and it's real low key, right? So these opposites almost in the story, but it gives you a whole of this even temperament from Winston Churchill. He never gets too high, never gets too low, never gets too bored, never gets too excited. It's very fun. But he's funny throughout the whole book. He really is. He describes himself doing math. Again, very young, but because we don't do any dates, it's like he's never not Winston Churchill. 5-year-old Winston Churchill is the same as 85-year-old Winston Churchill in a weird way. He says, the governess did not care if you were nearly right. I'm like, of course. What does nearly right have to do with math? You have to be right or wrong. He was like, there was this practice of pairing these figures together, and then they would do a certain thing. And then these figures would get in debt with other figures, and you'd have to pull from some to lend to the other. I'm like, that's just such a creative way to say, math. Pull the one Add it, subtraction, you have 100, you have 50. It's so creative. He never, and then he's like, I never really needed this. Uh, he, I wouldn't even say it jumps. Some of these are jumps in age, but it doesn't feel like a jump. He just defines a title and then just goes. He talks about when he's in Harrow. Apparently, it's a fancy school. Harrow at the age of 12. He he doesn't like school at all, right? He feels very he describes the worst parts of his life as being in school, and that from the schooling on, it's just wonderful. His own words he's described. But he would say, and it's weird because it's like you're in his head. He would act like it was a conspiracy or some injustice because the teacher, the headmaster, would constantly be asking him things he didn't know. When he would be much happier just answering the things he did know. He was like, it was that invariably the topics they wanted to discuss, the topics that most interested them, were of the least interest to me, and vice versa, right? So he constantly acts like there's this in his mind, this sort of this war happening between him and them, and that they just won't let him be. He pushes a kid into a pool. He pushes the kid into a pool, and then his friends are like, he's this higher grade than you. What are you doing? And his dad is this and that, and he's all this well-to-do. You're in trouble, bro, if you don't fix this. And then he's like, well, how could I know he was this higher person when he was just in a bath towel, and he's so small? It's not really my fault. He quote. Now we're kids in school. He quote says in his mind in this book, he's like, I approached the potentate. It's like, why are you overblowing to such an extent this interaction with this person? It's just unnecessary. And yet, what is it? It's unnecessary, but it is necessary. Because when he was 5 or 7 or whatever age he was, this was a big deal. It'd be like when you're in school. I always find these sort of the mundane day to day very hard to describe or to get descriptions of. We glaze over them. But your day doesn't feel mundane when you're living it, right? So when he was 7, this did feel like a potentate, a very important, a high to do person. His life's on the line. There's a major thing was on the scope. We know nothing you do when you're 7 is really going to ruin your whole life. But he can get you in the shoes of the 7-year-old with these big words, right? And so then in that sense, it's not overblowing it. It is necessary. And he does this throughout, whatever the minor sort of issue might be. I think, where did we go? He says, can y'all hear that plane? He says I was about to talk about military, and then I hear this plane. It's kind of wild. He says he chose a career in the military because he owned a lot of toy soldiers. Now again, this seems flippant, and I don't think it's very unlike these sort of aristocratic types. And I'm like, why would you pick such an important career for such a simple reason? But if you think about it, you can be a soldier for 5 years and that not be your whole life, not even a quarter of your whole life. And then you can go on and do something else. I mean, how often do people have buttoned up what they want to be the rest of their lives by the time they're, 17 or 20? Rarely happens. So I don't see this as too bad of a reason on the whole. And I feel like these aristocrats in this age did this a lot, where they'd randomly pick a thing and then sort of pivot out of it at a different stage in their life. And I don't think their friends judged them too harshly. I don't think it was too much of a waste of time either. You gain experience in these various activities that end up helping when you choose something else. So I don't have a problem with that. Okay, he's running from some kids. He climbs up a tree, and then he says that as he goes, quoted from the book, he goes, "I looked at it, I computed it, I calculated. The argument was correct, but the data was very wrong." And I'm like, "Looked at what? What argument?" In his mind, he got to the top of that tree, and in his mind, he thought, "I can jump, grab each branch going down, hit the ground nice and easy." This is what he thought. This is what he calculated. This is what he computed. And this is what he did. He jumped out of a tree, hit I don't know how many branches going down, and knocked himself out. He was laid up in the hospital for like a month or two. And again, I'm like, this sounds serious, but he plays it off a little bit. It's not that serious. To not upset the tone of his book, I think. But it was like a 30, 20-foot drop, people. He jumped out of a tree. Absolutely hilarious. The man's absolutely wild. He saw his dad was the prime minister, which I think has an effect more and more as you go. But his dad was the prime minister, and it was going bad for him because he's getting old. Right? You get old and you lose a step. But he describes as a youth seeing his father in that state, and he said that he hoped to grow up in time to come to his aid. That's how he describes it. And he describes a lot of the politics in these war type descriptions. But I thought that was a cool way to put it. That you get across a lot of the relationship just with sort of just one line. There wasn't much of a relationship. His dad's a stiff British man who was born in the Victorian age. He's not openly verbal. Not a lot of I love yous. This kind of thing. They were very stiff. That's just how it was. He ends up going to Sandhurst. I think this is a military college now at this point. And this is funny to me too. Funny to me, not funny in the book. But they would picking what sort of division you were in was important, and then trying to get in on that, right? So I want to be in the cavalry doesn't mean you're getting in the cavalry because you'd need to pull strings and this and that. Well, his dad was prime minister, so that should help. But his dad wanted him. I forget which one it was, but I think Winston Churchill. He goes, what did he say? He said he had already thought over the benefits of riding versus walking, and he thought riding was a better idea. Yeah, why walk when you can ride? He thought it'd be very fun to just run around on a horse, right? But his dad and his family were like, maybe not because it's expensive. Because in that time you're in the army, now your family has to pay to upkeep you, pay so you're getting fed and all this, or whatever else things you want. And if you do that, if you get them in the cavalry, you have to pay for the soldier and the upkeep of a horse. Which to me, again, I grew up in. If you join the army, everything's provided. You just go to the army; they'll give you whatever. You can be homeless, go to the army, and you got food, housing, weaponry, the whole works, the whole 9 yards. Now I know in spots it's a little different. They start making you buy uniforms, yada yada yada. But on the whole, you're not. You don't have to pay for the jeep, unless I'm mistaken. Since the last time I checked, if I'm mistaken, that's kind of wild. In any case. He wanted to be in the cavalry, and his sort of dad didn't want, but it ended up working the way it did. And you get a lot of sense of the time because what is it? It's the British Empire still intact. And so as young recruits, they're learning, they're getting educated. He doesn't spend a lot of time on that. You just sort of assume that he learned all these tactics at Sandhurst. He was talking about how they felt about things. There were Zulus, Afghans, Sudans, or India. They hoped at some point one of these might pop off. There might be some kind of Zulu or Afghan uprising, so that they can then go in and make some war on them. Because they wanted to get in some action, right? There's no point to them being in the army if you're not going to get into some action. They wanted the action. And he brings it up later where there was a time when war was more pleasant. What do I mean? I think he was in Afghanistan for some of these. No, India. He was in India fighting. Forget what the name of them are. I don't think it's Berbers. I don't know. It's not Berbers or like India, right? I mean, Afghanistan. Whatever the sheiks were in India, he was fighting some of them. And he gave them credit, their bravery, their strength, and whatnot. So they'd run in with swords, and he's like, well, Sandhurst told us that cavalry against foot soldiers, they just run away. He's like, well, that didn't happen. And, he's like, I quickly resolved not to fight with a sword, but to shoot people. In any case, if a British officer got taken down or soldier, they just hack him to pieces, right? War is still vicious. But if you compare his actions in India, rough as they are, they do not compare to the brutality of World War One, right? Because the way he describes it was a smaller number of people, all professional soldiers, and because it's so small and such a less of a drag on the nation's okay with like, go, you represent us. I wish you well. So you're getting positive vibes from the people. You feel good about yourself, and the scale of it never gets too large. It's a lot of one-on-one. The weapons are older. Muskets don't fire as fast. You can only kill so many people with a sword, right? And you hash it out between you and whoever the savages are or other professional soldiers. And by professional, they're beat, they give up. I'm beat, I give up. Now, when you fight savages, it gets a little harder. They might not want to give up. You might have to kill more than you'd like. But professional soldiers, on the whole, don't kill as many as when you have drafted soldiers, right? I think the Japanese drafted, the Russians drafted, the Germans drafted. And we were just killing just swabs of innocent people, women, children, bystanders, people aren't in the war, right? And he attributed this to democracy and science, sticking their nose in war. And I'm like, in a lot of ways it makes sense. Yes, war in his time was bad, but the numbers don't compare, right? Nowadays, for us, war isn't sort of like a pastime. It's a very serious thing that could then spiral out into, nuclear holocaust. And I think that's a big difference. And he has this sentiment a lot in this book, again, in others, where he would have loved to live, like to be born in Napoleon's time, to have it out with Napoleon for, all those years. He liked that idea, that romanticism of it. But he caught the tail end of it, so he only got a little taste of it. But it also explains to me a lot of World War One and Two. One especially, two sort of like an aftermath of one, where I would watch when I was young these specials, because they used to show specials like this on History Channel, and you're like the Somme or Verdun or all these places, and you're like, how many people? Like 100,000 people died in one day. I'm like, why are you charging a machine gun? That's stupid. Duck and cover, bro. Hide. Get behind cover. Shoot. Don't pop your head out. But if you came from a Victorian age and the science had overtaken you before you knew it, muskets don't shoot that fast. So even if it's an entrenched position, you charge that position. You lose 5 guys. You take the hill. These are old school soldiers in charge. Generals. They came from that era. And so they don't have an understanding of the kill potential of modern weaponry, right? A machine gun, belt-fed machine gun, just will not stop killing till the bullets run out. It can just lay down fire and just cut down wave after wave of human beings, right? And so then it clicked in my head. I'm like, oh, they had an old school thinking with new school machinery. Of course there's going to be mass killing. They had no idea. And before anyone figured it out, we lost I don't know how many people. Absolute madness. He he describes he says after he left Sandhurst, which he's done with sort of his schooling, he says life just sort of takes off for him. He says that he can't remember from leaving that school to the time of writing the book more than a handful of days with him having nothing to do. He says I never had time to turn around, and this is accurate. If you look at his life, it's one of the most jam-packed lives I can find anywhere for anyone. Just I don't know what happened. He caught a wave and just went right, cut a swab right through history. It's actually incredible. Um, there's one part I think he's in Afghanistan. I think it's Afghanistan, and he describes it, and it's so fun because again, I can't read a Winston Churchill book without hearing sort of in the Winston Churchill way of talking. So he's like, I've never been opposed to the obese amongst us, and in this instance, when my when when my the person next to me was a bit on the large side, I didn't matter because if the firing started, maybe then he would, happily take a shot for me instead of the other way around, which I found preferable. Right? So he jokes like this, and they catch you off guard sometime. But to see a sort of a fat guy next to you, a fat soldier, and to think, yeah, I'm happy he's fat. Maybe maybe he'll take a round for me instead. It's selfish and it's funny at the same time. Good gravy. The back half of this book is his war correspondence in the Boer War. He wanted to be in the army. He wanted to go fight the Boers. Now, again, when I first heard Boers without a map, I thought this was somewhere in India for some reason. It's not. It's in South Africa, I believe. And the Boers are basically Germanic peoples who moved from Germany down to this area as they colonized, right? Well, what happens? What happens is they discover gold. And now the British Empire's like, hold on a second. I think this is mine. And the Boers are like, it isn't. And so they start fighting. Now, it's pretty vicious for a while. He couldn't get in the army because the guy didn't have room for him, but he still wanted to be in the action, so he got himself a war correspondence gig. So you have now a war correspondent who is son of the former prime minister in a war zone. And he's in this war zone, handles himself with all due distinction. And I'm talking, he walks around and the bullets are flying. He doesn't even flinch. He's not ducking for cover. I think he said in a few points, and Napoleon sort of says the same thing, where if you are what you think you're going to be, then there's no point in hiding. If the bullet finds you, it finds you. But it's not going to find you. They have this confidence about them, like, I'm going to matter such in the world that fate just won't let me die here. So, what does Napoleon say? We might as well lean on her a little bit. You just do things. These types just act. And fate just works out in their favor. They just don't catch around. They just don't die. It's very strange to watch. But he said it. He said it a bunch in other books as well, where he's like, I just assumed fate had something for me, and so I didn't worry about it. So he's walking around getting shot at in this train. The train gets taken over. He gets captured. So now he's a former prime minister that's captured. Well, they don't have the greatest setup. Right? All the officers can talk to each other. There's more of the British officers than the Boer guards. It's not very well fortified. So they're like, we can escape. And in his mind, they're like, if we can get all the guns, we can have this fighting force entrenched in there in the heartland of the enemy and all this and that. The escape goes south in a hurry, so that he ends up by himself, running around in the woods with chocolate, a bar of chocolate. A bar of chocolate. And he's like, well, it certainly makes you not It feeds you, but it doesn't satisfy, this chocolate. I'd rather have more. uh, he wants to hop a train, but the trains don't run at night, so he just starts walking the track. He finds a little alcove of people, and he's just like, look, I can't go back. I just got to go in. So he just goes in, he knocks on a door, and he like, help me, help me. I fell off the train, I was knocked out. The guy comes down, sets him at his kitchen table, and puts a revolver on the table. And the guy's like, I'd like to know a little bit more about you. And Winston Churchill's like, I think I'd rather tell you the truth now. I'm like, well, there's guns involved. Let me not get shot. And the guy's like, I think you should too. So he just flat tells him, I'm Winston Churchill, I was captured, and I'm escaping. And you don't know what's going to happen. And the guy's like, good thing for you, you stopped here. I'm the only agreeable house you'd have had in 20 miles. He's a British guy. And he's kept there to run equipment or whatever. In any case. He's like, I'll hide you. I got to hide you in the mine. And the only problem is this Dutch girl. Because she counts every ounce of food to come out of this house. And I'm going to have to explain why you ate this mutton. So he hides underground. Again, his descriptions of everything are just a joy to read. It really are. If you have time, it's not a long book. Give it a go. He hides underground. They find a way to hide him amongst hay bales to a train right to Portuguese territory, just right out of the area. He jumps out, he shouts for joy, and he makes it to the British consulate, where obviously they're going to do everything they can to help him now. They find out who he is. And it turns out that he escaped right in the heart of a lot of losses. They had lost a lot of ground to the Boers, a lot of battles. And, of course, then the press is going to snatch this harrowing escape rescue by a former prime minister's kid to great effect, right? So he gets early fame, if he wasn't already going to be famous, off of this. I believe he goes back in. He goes back in at some point. Let me see, what else I got? It's about the high and low of it. Again, it's longer. It's not every detail. Every detail he brings up, though, is a joy. Learning math. The not liking testing. All these kind of things. Even his descriptions of behind-the-scenes politics that comes up. All of these things he makes in such an interesting way. The book ends just almost like an end. But like I said, because there's no real narrative, there's no actual wind down. It's just the man talking, and he gets to and then I met a lady, and she became my wife. We lived happily ever after. End, basically, right? He doesn't wind it down in any kind of way. And I'm going to be honest, I could have listened to him talk about the rest of his life. I think this book was, I don't think it read 10, 12 hours. I don't know. It's very short. But if he wanted to talk for 65 more hours about his life, I would have listened to everything he said. Even if I knew, even without knowing, his life ends up in World War II and he's fighting Hitler, right? Even if he'd had just a normal political life, I don't think there's any way this man would have been boring. I would listen to literally anything he had to talk about. That's how interesting this book comes off. And that's a little bit of Winnie in your life. I swear you need it. I don't doubt I'm going to go re-listen to this at some point. Probably next year, just for fun. Just to hang out with Winston Churchill. All right. It's very hot in Texas. I think I've gone long enough. I'm getting good now at not staring at the clock. So I'm proud of myself. Okay, but I'm going to hit you with ads now so you can leave if you want. Okay, ad time. These are my books. I'm going to be honest. I think this Winston Churchill book might be better than mine. Go give it a go. If you have to choose. If you have to choose between my book and Winnie, go get some Winnie in your life. I really wish I could talk like this fool. Obviously, buy my books. They help the channel more than almost anything. I mean, that's the point of this channel, is to hawk books to unsuspecting readers. I think you'll like them, though. Thank you all for listening. These are incredibly fun. And I'll see you all next week.